Wonderful job. You did. The house is open for questions.
So I think I have a question about is there a commonality between the rugged individualism that you were talking about, Larry, particularly, and if we were to look at films from other countries, would there be any type of parallelism between the individual versus the collective?
A very interesting question. I think most of us realize that Europe is quite different from the United States. Isn't it interesting that we are the only nation in the industrialized world that does not have a national health plan? And isn't that interesting? And as soon as you start talking about a national health plan, you're talking socialism, you're talking communism, you're talking a collective constraint upon free will. And it's very unclear whether or not Obama's health care plan is going to make it through the Supreme Court. There isn't a European country that doesn't have an adequate national health plan. This is just one example, I think, that delineates the fundamental distinction between our culture and that of Europe.
Well, also you have age. Our culture
Our culture in the overall scheme of things is younger than the European culture. So I don't know if that comes into play, if there's something about maturing, or if it came out of the feudal time. The notion of, the all, benevolent king and blah, blah.
Well, let me just, I don't think our age has anything to do with it. I think it is the actual circumstances of our fundamental creation. We didn't go through a monarchical period. We didn't go through an autocracy period. We began right away with John Locke, the father of liberalism. Jefferson took Locke's own words. All he did was change Locke's reference to property into happiness. But he simply borrowed from Locke what we all take for granted today as our political foundation.
Could you tell us who you are, please, when you ask the question?
Sorry, Tina Stanton. I'm soon to be of UMass Boston. I had a question. I was wondering that we focus on the political influence or reflection in movies, but one of the movies that comes to mind when I'm thinking about social change that is possible, and whether it's reflection or influence, is from the late 60s, To Serve with Love. I remember my mother telling me about the first time she saw that movie, being completely shocked that for the first time it was about a black teacher and white students. And even today we don't see that. In educational influential movies, we see, affluent teacher moving into, underclass classrooms, things like that. So I was just curious if you see the same correlation between politics in movies as social change in movies.
Yes and no. I think To Serve with Love is a really interesting example, given that it was set in London, and which I don't think it perhaps could have. I'm not sure it would have been done here. I mean, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was 5 or 6 years later, I think. I don't remember the chronology exactly, which was a sort of similar story. The social, when it comes to race especially, I think there was a kind of renaissance of the social issue, social message movies in the 60s, and that did come back. But if it's, sorry, I sort of lost track of the second part of your question.
Basically, if you think that Hollywood reflects real life in politics, do you think that the same can be said for real life in social change?
Yes, I think there have been films that do that, but again, they're rare and unusual, is my sense.
I just want to address the race issue in terms of Hollywood. Notice that the first films that dealt with racism were essentially done by independent filmmakers. Stanley Kramer did Home of the Brave in 1949. It was Darrell F. Zanuck, who was the only non-Jewish head of a Hollywood movie studio, who did Pinky in 1951, and who did actually No Way Out in 1950, Sidney Poitier's first film. It was Stanley Kramer that did Member of the Wedding, with a great role for Ethel Waters. But Hollywood, whether it's dealing with Jews, or blacks, or homosexuals, no. Today, I'll tell you, the taboo subject today is Israel. No Hollywood filmmaker in his right mind is going to approach anything to do with Israel unless it's this recent film called The Debt, which is perfectly safe because you have the Mossad chasing after a vicious, monstrous Nazi. That's okay, as long as you stay away, from the current situation. My point is that Hollywood is very wary of subjects that are going to get them into trouble. Steven Spielberg learned, to his regret, that even with all his power, the making of Munich may have been a mistake. He paid a heavy penalty.
You asked, sorry, David Mason is my name. You asked if we could think of a film which actually changed society, and one of them was one you showed, which was Birth of a Nation. Because prior to 1917, 1919, when it came out, the Ku Klux Klan was pretty quiescent. And in the wake of that film, it really was reformed and became a very active social force throughout the 1920s. If you say changes are not always for the good, but for a film that did actually have a big social impact, I think that would be one.
Yeah, that's a good point. It did have that impact. And Griffith himself, D.W. Griffith, the Birth of a Nation, was allegedly very anti-reform and anti-reformist himself, and didn't actually believe that films could have much of an impact one way or the other, which may have been what led him in part to make that what turned out to be a very controversial film.
Hi, my name is Ray Ellman. I think the question isn't whether films are reflective of society or thought leaders for society. I think it's more that films tend to amplify ideas that influence people in a big way. And I'm thinking about how there are things like nuclear energy, which China syndrome kind of created fears of, and films like that cause people to think in a different way. And there's so many people in this country that don't really get into issues in depth anyway when they're voting, especially in presidential elections. They want to vote for somebody that they'll go out and have a beer with. That if they've been emotionally influenced by a film that has some political context, it can change the way they think about the issues.
May I comment? Your comment stimulated a thought. I'm thinking of a film called Mississippi Burning, which was a bad film. It was a bad film, but it had good social impact. And that's an interesting question. If a film distorts history, if a film gives credit where it's not due, and yet it arouses, let's say, young people to be conscious of the civil rights movement and the horrors of racism, how do you balance that out? I'm thinking also of the TV series The Holocaust, which came out in 1978, severely criticized by Elie Wiesel. I think he was wrong, because the impact on not hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of people, not only here in America, but particularly in Germany, was highly positive and therapeutic.
And yeah, interesting you mentioned Mississippi Burning. That was on our list for a while, and for whatever reason fell off. But the reason I thought it was so interesting is that, and what I think you were referring to is that it makes the FBI look like the heroes of the civil rights movement. I mean, so talk about a depiction of government, which, as it turns out, was not totally accurate, but it certainly attempted to portray government in a particular way.
Hi, Marilyn Spence-Lloyd. What impact do you think a filmmaker like Roger Moore has on people? Is he preaching to the converted, or is he bringing up so much conversation and discussion that indeed there are some people who make films with messages that are carry on into society and make some difference?
Well, as a documentary filmmaker, I'll jump in there. You know, Michael Moore, well, the whole world of documentaries is a different issue, and I think I could probably name 3 or 4 documentaries right now that really did change public policy and have changed legislation and have changed the way the government operates in various ways in the judicial system and elsewhere. Not sure that any of Michael Moore's have actually achieved that yet, but I mean, he's a bomb thrower. You know, he's inflammatory. He's less a documentary filmmaker, certainly not a feature filmmaker. He occupies a kind of unusual position as a political entertainer or something, which is also good and can affect change, no question. But I like to think that documentaries are more grounded in reality than his sometimes are. So.
Eric, why don't you comment on Errol Morris?
Yeah, well, Errol Morris, I think, is a very different kind of filmmaker, and a documentarian also, and a very artful filmmaker. But I never feel misled or somehow manipulated by Errol Morris films. They're manipulative visually, they're very stylized and all that, but I don't feel like he's messing with the truth. And I do feel that Michael Moore does sometimes mess with the truth. And all films mess with the truth, of course, on some level. But it's a question of degree, I think.
Frederick Wiseman, perhaps, to answer go back to your question. I'm not that familiar with the body of his work, but I know that it's been impactful and has possibly affected policy, let's say, toward mental institutions. Maybe you could.
Yeah, well, his famous film Titicut Follies made at the, I don't know, it was Bridgewater or one of the state mental hospitals in the early 60s, and then was suppressed for 20 years or something. I mean, it's only recently been able to be seen, but that, I think just the fact that it was made, even though it was hardly ever seen, the fact that it had been made and that evidence existed on film, I think had a huge difference on state policies.
We had a request that you mention a few more of the examples of documentaries or documentary filmmakers that you had in mind, so you could name.
Well, just recently, some of you probably heard about the accused murderers in Memphis who were released, and the Memphis 4, I think they were three. And that was a result largely of 2 documentary filmmakers who started following that case years ago and have made now 3 films about it. And that certainly is that. Errol Morris, who Larry brought up, is famous for The Thin Blue Line, which got somebody who'd been wrongly convicted of murder out of prison. Now you put me on the spot. I'm sure other people can think of some.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Junaid Araglu. I teach business here at Northeastern. I just made a quick comment. In the late 90s, I remember watching a movie where Robert De Niro, I think it was called Wag the Dog, where Robert De Niro was playing the president who was manufacturing news stories to go into war on false pretenses. Just wanted to mention that.
David Mamet, screenplay. Did he direct? I don't think Mamet directed, but he wrote it.
Jed Schwartz. I'm reading this book by Douglas Ruskoff called Life, Inc., which makes the same thesis about individualism that Dr. Lowenthal makes. But it says, the thesis is that the individualism is constructed in defense of corporatism, and corporatism is a sort of mutation of individualism, I think, because it's a kind of a artificial collectivity. I just wondered if you have any comment on that, and also, do you think that Robert McNamara might have seen 7 Days in May, which I think came out in 1961? I couldn't help but notice the resemblance between the president and in the film and Robert McNamara, and I'm wondering whether you think that perhaps his hawkish stance in the Vietnam War may have come about as a kind of reaction to that film.
Just a comment on the first point of your question. Individuals have a soul. Corporations do not have a soul. I believe that our cult of individualism is religious in origin. This is a very religious nation. You go back to Europe. Europe is not religious anymore. I was amazed. I just came back from Spain. 25% of Spaniards identify themselves either as agnostic or atheist. Spain. Compare American religious statistics to any country in Europe, and you'll see a radical distinction. I think it's a very serious issue. Individual as opposed to the corporate or the collective. We're talking about soul, we're talking about redemption, we're talking about salvation. And if you talk about a collective, you have to begin with the individual who is either willing or not willing to participate in the collective. You have to begin with the individual. Going to McNamara approach you.
That's a good question. I often wonder what McNamara thought of anything. I mean, read his books, they're just so opaque. And if those of you who saw the film with that are immersed with the fog of war, I mean, it's just impossible to figure out, candid as he is, what he was thinking. So I'm afraid I have nothing to offer on that. It's a good question.
Hi, Bill Ray. I'm curious as to your comments on a particular film that came out exactly the same time as Easy Rider, and this film didn't make 25 cents. I remember literally seeing it on a double bill with the film. It was a semi-documentary, fictional story told at, I'm sure you know where this is going, at the Chicago Democratic Convention. It was called Medium Cool. Showed protest, dissent, the actual government reaction with a fictional story laid over the top. I'm curious as to your thoughts about that film.
The film was made by Haskell Wexler, who was a brilliant photographer. I think this was the only film that he actually directed. It starred Robert Forster. I remember the film sort of vaguely. It's amazing how few American films have really dealt with the 1968 upheaval, which was so tumultuous and so incredibly powerful. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something.
Well,
Medium Cool was one of the few.
Yeah.
And the ones that tried to deal with it did a terrible job.
Yeah, most of them were pretty bad. Well, just another word on Medium Cool, because that also was on our list for a while, and then things got jumbled. But what's the amazing moment in Medium Cool is when Haskell Wexler and his film crew are out filming their actors in the midst of the demonstrations in Grant Park on, I don't know, the second day or something of the demonstrations. And it all got out of control very quickly. And the film crew and the actors are suddenly surrounded by fleeing hippies or demonstrators and charging police, their Daley's police. And you hear on the film track, Haskell, watch out, it's real. And it's all in the film, and you see the actors are running, looking really scared. The camera suddenly sort of drove. And it was, I mean, it was, I mean, that's why, I don't know if he was calling the film medium cool, which is a Marshall McLuhan term, I can't remember now all those terms, but, you know, it was the idea that the two media were somehow coming together, the fiction and the real.
I just advance on that point, Easy Rider, which I'm sure all of us have seen. The scene where the three of them, Jack Nicholson, Hopper, and DeFonda, come into the small town in Texas, and they're belittled by all the habitués of the cafe. Those were real habitués. And those vicious, racist, bigoted comments were actual comments coming out of these people.
Oh, wow.
Dennis Hopper said, these are the guys, I want these people in the film. And they simply approached him and said, we'll pay you some money, just talk as you would just as you were talking now when we came into the cafe. It was a very scary kind of sequence in Easy Rider. These were mean people. These were really nasty, bigoted people who were incorporated into the film. See it again. I think it'll give you a kind of chill.
I have a question for Eric. Just kind of.
Would you identify yourself?
Sorry, my name's Project Taggy. I have a question in regards to, you mentioned earlier that film's a reflection of society. You know, as a documentary filmmaker, or if you're in the position of a studio producer, what movie would you make to be a reflection of American society and government as it is now? Would it have that angry narrative that we hear all the time now, that comes from the Tea Party and some of your neoconservatives? Or would you have a different angle on it?
I mean, if I were making my own film now? No, what I think right now would be the most interesting kind of story about government would be to try to figure out what government can do to address the problems of the middle class, to address what's happening in this economic squeeze that people are caught in. And I'm sure we're going to see those pretty soon. There have been one or two already. There was a film last year with, it's called The Company Man or Company Men, you know, which sort of started to get at it. But that film was a response to the 2008 recession. And now I think there are going to be films.
Or even Up in the Air.
Up in the air is what it's saying.
Oh, Up in the Air too, right? But I think there are going to be films now that take that to a much deeper level of misery. I hope so. and they should. And so, although during the Great Depression of the 30s, Hollywood went exactly the other way. It went as far from realism as they could go. So, who knows? But anyway, that's what I would try for. That's probably why I wouldn't make it in Hollywood.
Mel Langboy. It seems that Hollywood also makes TV programs. And TV programs are on every week, especially with series. And it seems if you watch some of these series, that there's definitely political messages in terms of trying to change opinions and attitudes of people. As an example, I forget what the name of the episode is or what the show is, but you have, for example, women presidents, you have black presidents, you have women executives, all sorts of things. And is this a deliberate attempt to try and change attitudes?
I think it's a deliberate attempt to reach a wider market. Nevertheless, it's interesting and exemplary, perhaps, to depict important, powerful roles being played by women and minorities. I think that's good. The intent or the impulse behind it, we're living in a far more liberal age. By the way, what also strikes me about a number of films that I've seen, and I don't see that many American films. I'm obsessed with European films, quite frankly. Thank God for Netflix. Unbelievable. Notice how many American films depict the CIA as an absolute swamp of evil. I've seen American films, I think The Patriots Game, where the President of the United States ultimately is the villain. Am I wrong? One of those Harrison Ford blockbuster films. Wow, what's that all about? The ultimate disrespect, you know, for the role of president in a Hollywood film is to cast him as a nasty villain.
Is that about George Bush?
If I could take the liberty of adding a question or a comment on that. My favorite depiction of government is not even a film, it's West Wing. Like President Jim Barton. And I was hoping, because it also shows the complexity of how difficult it is when you're trying to do the right thing and so on. But then after a while I realized that West Wing was attracting only a certain type of viewer, more similar to me, and not so much the ones that I wish would watch it.
Thank you. I'd like to build up on your last point, and I love your analysis of American celebration of individualism, relating that to the movies. If I think back over the large span of movies, there are some, like The West Wing and The American President, representing the nobility, of what government can be and can do. But I think that's the minority. The vast majority of film, whether it's from the 20s forward, has been, including The Godfather and everything else, has always been about how inherently corrupt government and the police force are, and by implication always will be. It seemed to me that the film, cinema, has bred a cynicism about the possibility of government, not a positive inspiration about what government could be. And that, in my opinion, turning it into a question, would you agree that film has had that effect, or would you disagree?
I would agree, but let's not forget that filmmaking is a business. And scriptwriters are searching continuously and relentlessly for the most dramatic situations that they can conjure up. So to depict the President of the United States as a villain, hey, that's cool, that's really shocking, that's going to really compel the attention of a lot of people. It's just searching for the most dramatic motif. But you're right, the ultimate effect is to breed cynicism. Now, I guess if I really wanted to pursue my fundamental point, the breeding on the part of Hollywood of that cynicism toward government is directly related fundamentally to the cult of individualism, which I believe is biblical in origin.
But I would add, though, that you didn't see that, or you certainly didn't see the number of those kinds of films until after Watergate. And I think Watergate, which played out like a movie, I mean, it just, could have been became a Hollywood story, of course, a very successful one. But while we were all watching it, it felt like we were watching this almost unbelievable fiction play out. And I think after that, all the barriers were down, and it was sort of open season on government in a way. You could almost say nothing that was too cynical or too accusatory about the levels of corruption and venality at all levels. And I think it wasn't just at the federal level, I think it kind of spread down.
Ron Goldstein, it seems like there's three different methods of communication in these films. Art, or preaching, or comedy. Do you two have an opinion on which one is more effective?
Bulworth, right? An interesting blend of comedy, a subtext of a message, how nonsensical politicians are, how full of crap they are, and here's a character who just says the truth, and at the end he's assassinated. That was a shock. What is the film doing? It catches you up quite short at the end to see the hero killed. And it makes you approach or reapproach the fundamental themes of the film, perhaps with a more serious demeanor, serious mood.
Yeah, I think also has to do with the marketability of the time when these films come out. I mean, audiences have become very demanding, very sophisticated. They really want shock and all that. So that's why Bulworth, I think, was a relatively successful movie. It'll be interesting to see how this Ides of March film does. It looks very much like a political thriller, like Advise and Consent or 7 Days in May, although it doesn't have the sort of
The film in my mind when I asked that question was Dr. Strangelove.
Well, I thought Failsafe which is the serious counterpart to Dr. Strangelove, that came out, I think, about the same time, 63, 64. And now in Failsafe, Walter Matthau plays the Henry Kissinger, Werner von Braun character, whatever he is, the civilian who's more of a warmonger than the military. I mean, it was an interesting twist, and very much like Dr. Strangelove too, but done in the serious vein. I don't know, I think more, obviously, if we raised hands, I bet more people would have seen Dr. Strangelove than Failsafe, so that might be an answer to your question.
Also, Terry Southern wrote Dr. Strangelove, and he also wrote essentially the script for Easy Rider. Terry Southern was a red-hot item in Hollywood in the 60s, he really was. And he blended these motifs, these approaches to the subject. Comedy, you're laughing hysterically 1 minute, and the next minute, the two protagonists of Easy Rider are just blown away. So I think that's how I'm responding to your point. These are complex approaches to subject matter that can be comical, farcical, and then suddenly tragic. Yeah.
And there's another vein that, and this is really a kind of a footnote, but in the late 30s, early 40s, as part of the WPA, there was the Film and Photo League, people out taking photographs, but also making films that blended documentary and fictional scenes. And those were very much social issue films, trying to make the case for the New Deal and for New Deal programs. And I don't think they got into the theaters much at all. I don't think that was not a good marketing move on the part of the New Deal. But, at least people were trying. I mean, there were these moments trying to get those films out there.
Yes, I'm Jerry Berwick. In watching all of that film, the one thing that stuck in my mind was that in the film Wilson, with the president making an impassioned plea not to go to war. And my only reaction was, where the hell was he in 2003? And to get a comment on that.
Poor Woodrow Wilson is kind of discredited these days, I think, in a lot of ways. It's hard to imagine anyone talking that way anymore.
The film came out in 1944, and I saw it. I don't know how, because I was only 6 years old. I saw that film. Yeah.
Maybe your parents thought it was a good way to get
I was a precocious moviegoer.
Woodrow Wilson supposedly, I mean, this is maybe an apocryphal story, had Birth of a Nation shown at the White House.
Yes.
And maybe the first film ever shown at the White House. And he's reported to have said, it's like writing history with lightning, and it's all true.
Wow. Well, he was a Southerner, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And a racist.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tina Stanton again. I was curious, I love movies that reflect sort of the chaos of campaign politics. One documentary that comes to mind is Unbought and Unbossed from 2004 on Shirley Chisholm's Democratic run in '72. Really, really great look at sort of how those things work. Some fictional ones, they come up, they're almost always satirical. Primary Colors, Bulwer, yeah. Exactly. And so I was wondering if you had any examples, fictional or documentary, about campaign politics and how sort of that's reflected in Hollywood.
Well, a documentary called Primary, which followed Jack Kennedy's campaign in West Virginia. And it's an interesting film for documentary history because it was one of the first times when a film crew could use a small camera with sync sound. And so they didn't have to have a separate sound recordist. It was a much smaller, less intrusive, more maneuverable kind of camera setup, which, you know, a lot of times it's amazing how technology does drive filmmaking in some ways, and that made a big difference. I mean, the Kennedy people they sort of stopped noticing this little camera, and that's a wonderful film. Robert Drew, I think, and D.A. Pennebaker. I'm not absolutely sure on that. I think that's did it. Excuse me, The Seduction of Joe Tynan. I mean, that's not really about a campaign. He's campaigning for something or other while in the Senate. But I'd forgotten that film. And
The War Room.
It's kind of interesting.
The War Room.
Oh, The War Room. Yeah, that's true. Great documentary.
Candidate? The candidate.
And The Candidate, Robert Redford. Yeah.
My name is Mary Kay Brown. When you asked us to think about film, and as we were watching those clips, I started to think about some of the more powerful, impactful films. And I want to just throw into the mix my long history of the cop, the lawman as the hero. It was a huge part of our culture. John Wayne, Jack Ryan, all those characters. The question to you, though, is something about the financing of film. It's amazing to me our love affair in films with this techno-war and how we conduct war. All the gadgets from Iron Man to, there's a lot of examples of it. Top Gun is the one that springs to mind. I remember people going crazy when Top Gun came out and going to see it a couple times. It wasn't just Tom Cruise, it was the planes and the, it makes me wonder who's financing movies, because I do believe we use movies to underwrite support for large things like that.
Financing is really interesting. We know of films that were made for $25,000. Edward Burns, for instance, made his first big hit. He used his mother's house. He used his credit card, and I think he used his mother's. He did for like $25,000. Easy Rider cost $360,000. That was the budget. It grossed about 70 million, and that's what paved the way for a number of years for independent films that were financed by people who hoped to score again with something like Easy Rider. Easy Rider, by the way, was the first independent film ever released by a major studio, Columbia. The film was historic in its impact on the physical making of films. But how do you finance your
Well, mine are so small that we don't get involved. I usually get foundation money or occasionally other sources. But your question did make me think about the one time that I had to approach the U.S. Navy for help. We were making a documentary about World War II submarines, and I forgot exactly what we were asking them for, but they are set up, and I've learned now know that each branch of the military has a huge office devoted to helping filmmakers, not documentary filmmakers. I found out they couldn't quite figure out what we were talking about. They're all about working with Hollywood, and they'll provide aircraft carriers and missiles and jet planes and totally have time for you. And I don't know I haven't ever figured out what that costs the filmmakers, or whether it's, they get a break on it. I know actually for documentaries though, at one point there were documentaries being made for PBS, not necessarily by PBS, but they were ending up on PBS, life aboard an aircraft carrier, life aboard a destroyer, and this and that, where a camera crew would go and spend quite a bit of time for free, with free room and board, on board a ship or whatever it is at the base, and then make the film and sell it to PBS. And that always struck me as a little, not quite fair, but anyway, they can make it easy.
Judy Potts. I thought of two things when I was watching the film. One was the passion that's depicted on the part of politicians. And I was watching Jimmy Stewart and his great passionate speech. And at the same time, there was that little thought in my head that said, oh yeah, right. Because the picture that we get of politicians, for the most part, are selfish, obstructive, and we don't see that, and we want to. I want Jimmy Stewart to represent me in Congress. And I think part of the aversion that we get to the politicians and stuff comes from the 24/7 reporting of news, because anything that happens that involves anybody that's involved in politics is on the news, and it's on hour after hour after, in lead-ins and everything else. Hollywood, on the other hand, shows us some very passionate things, and I think we're torn. And I think this is an American thing, looking for the, truth, justice, and the American way, and trying to get around the fact that the CIA are a bunch of bad guys gonna hurt us. I know that's not a question, but...
No, that's very poignant. I find that quite poignant. We long for integrity in our political system. We long for it. It's the most human inclination to want to be represented by decent government. And maybe you're right. Maybe the media is bludgeoning our sensitivity to our basic aspirations toward idealized government. I don't know, but I'm glad you shared that with us. Thanks.
Just to add that the two film clips we showed about the great populists, All the King's Men and The Last Hurrah, both end sadly. I mean, Willie Stark, the fictional character based on Huey Long, he ends up assassinated. He's unleashed powers that he can't control. He's somehow, he goes from being this populist leader to a demagogue and then pays the ultimate price. In The Last Hurrah, the Mayor Curley character, Frank Skeffington, it's a different issue. He just outlives his period, and but it's also sort of a sad ending, and this idea that he was great for his time, but that somehow he couldn't keep up with it, and he lost his power and his ability to help people, and that was a hard thing for me to try to figure out, what is that message? What is it saying about these leaders, who both of them were extremely passionate and very effective and helped hundreds of thousands of people in their time. And yet the suggestion is, by the time these films are being made in the 1950s, that that era is over.
Philip Freeman. I was intrigued by Professor Lowenthal's issue about individualism versus the collective in film. I was thinking it's hard to, particularly looking at these film clips, think of Hollywood cinema and its approaches to government separate from the star system. Whatever films we refer to, whether we imagine them to be progressive or reinforcing more conservative ideals, what we remember are the stars. We refer to that George Clooney movie, or that Gregory Peck movie, or that Burt Lancaster movie. The star is central as an object of identification that invites us into this collective daydream. The way Hollywood cinema has always been known around the world, and criticism is as illusionist cinema. It's to invite us into an illusion, and it's a private illusion that we participate in, so that probably that identification and the illusion has a stronger influence than whatever the political leanings might be. And if the film actually gets preachy on one side or the other and defeats the illusion, it just is experienced as a bad film, and people stay away in droves. And to come up with a collectivist aesthetic is quite a challenge with few historical precedents. I suppose probably the most significant of which would have been early Soviet cinema with Eisenstein and there was no star system, but he used montage cinema to juxtapose images to create an idea in the mind of the viewer. That's a different, somewhat less visceral experience, but effective. The only other thing that comes to mind would be someone like Jean-Luc Godard of the New Wave, where he is effectively a collectivist proponent, probably not because he attacks government, which he doesn't necessarily do in his movies. It's that he attacks, albeit lovingly, Hollywood illusionist cinema, and his films are attacks on the very techniques of editing and lighting that most effectively create the illusion that we're invited into.
But who could watch the later Godard? They're unwatchable. The point of stardom is that figure allows us, yes, to indulge in fanciful illusions. And by the way, you're mentioning of Soviet cinema. This is a fundamental distinction between obviously communist, the whole communist perception of the purpose of art is for a collective impact, a collective. It's not true of Western cinema at all. And what we may want in terms of the ultimate sociological impact from Hollywood films is simply irrational and unreal. The whole issue of stardom I find fascinating. I just don't have the equipment off the top of my head to penetrate into the issue, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, I was interested to read that one of the impulses that led to the end of those early silent movies that were attempting some kind of social change or some kind of message was when American films started becoming successful abroad. And it wasn't so much that the Europeans weren't interested in social messages, as that they were very different social messages than they knew anything about. The social context didn't work, the political context didn't work. And so the Europeans weren't buying American films that had anything to do with American politics or government or particular social issues. And so that was one of the other reasons why the early film industry just started letting go of anything like that.
What a night. We could go on for hours. We're fascinated by film, fascinated what it tells us about ourselves. I'm reminded, because my friend Ray Elman is here, that if you look at the 1930s and you look at newspapers, we have the development of comic strips. Superman, Batman, the Phantom, the Green Hornet. In fact, there's a wonderful book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which tells part of the story of the development of these superheroes at a time when we were all feeling so threatened by the Depression, by the coming of Nazism in Europe. And once again, we are at a time in which there's great fear in the land. And I think once again we may get, and we did see Superman, Batman, etc., being brought back to the big silver screen. So there's 1,000 ways we could talk about it, but once again I want to thank Carissa for the spectacular film clips, and of course for one of the most fascinating evenings we've had in the 4 years of this open classroom. Next week, we're going to take a look at values and markets. We have a wonderful philosopher here, Steve Nathanson, who's going to lead us through a discussion of what are the values of that stand behind our conception of government. And we'll continue doing that over the next couple weeks before we start looking at the economics of Milton Friedman, Ken Galbraith, and others. So stay tuned. We hope to see you next Wednesday night. Be well, drive carefully.